What if there were financial solutions being created by brave and brilliant women, a feminist economic model? A new organization of women is realizing that woman-centered model, lifting up women activists and their real-world solutions for building an economy of our own.
90 years ago, in a famous essay, Virginia Woolf advised a young woman writer that she needed two things, an income and a room of her own. After decades of a pay gap and big money's corruption, we need more than that today. We're creating an economy of our own.
An economy of our own is creating awareness of how rigged the current economy is and how many inspiring solutions are rising because of the work of brilliant women activists.
Women have been cheated and exploited by a mean economy for so long. But that's why we're in the best position to fix it together. And we're starting right now.
The people who have been most excluded by that system are the ones that have the deepest understanding of what has to be transformed. It is from that knowledge that it's very important for them to lead. That is leadership we absolutely have to have.
Screwnomics is my word for the widely applied economic theory, I guess, that women should always work for less, or even better, for free. Together, we can create a living economic ecology. But to do that, we're going to need to make economics far more sexy than it is today. There are feminist economic solutions, real world fixes that are working in communities right now, communities like yours.
An economy of our own is all about creating the space to lift up solutions women are advancing. We're here to celebrate women's way of knowing about money, bring you the work they're doing to shake up the system, and compile critical resources for activists like you who want to bring these kinds of changes into your own communities. Put your head together with us. It's the way we create real solutions, talking together about building an economy that works for all of us. We want an economy of our own. We want it now. And if you do too, join us today at aneconomyofourOwn.org.
Hello, everyone. Hello.
Hello, hello, hello. It is I, Carmen, from that video with longer hair. I'm also the AEOO Digital Director, as well as a member of the advisory board. So before Ricky and Rasheedah get started, I'm so excited to see everyone here and just wanted to give a quick rundown, because I know we're all very familiar with Zoom by now, of some of the features since tonight is a webinar and not a meeting. So you've likely noticed that only our panelists are visible, but we still want to hear from you, and attendees can still chat and ask questions. So go ahead and use the chat feature in your toolbar to tell us where you're logging on from. Make sure that you toggle it. You'll see that there's a little bar that says to. Make sure that instead of hosts and panelists, you're sending to everyone so that all your other attendees can see your responses. And then for questions tonight, we'll be using the Q&A feature that's also on your toolbar. You'll see it kind of looks like two discussion bubbles interacting with each other. And that's how we'll be collecting questions tonight. And Mary Beth, did you want to say hi?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Mary Beth Gardam from Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. We are partners and collaborators with An Economy of Our Own. Tonight, I'll be managing the chat and doing timekeeping to keep us moving along. So go ahead and check out the chat feature now. Tell us where you're joining us from. During the event, feel free to add questions via the Q&A feature rather than the chat. If questions end up in the chat accidentally, I'll transfer them to Q&A, but we'd prefer to keep everything together in Q&A. That's my job, my task, and I'm so glad to see everybody. And now here's Ricky, our facilitator for tonight.
Hello, hello. You've met me in the video as well, and I'm also with An Economy of Our Own. And I am really delighted to be inviting Rasheedah Phillips back to talk with us. We'll get back to her in a minute. But first of all, I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page and share with you some basic assumptions and intentions that we have here at AEOO. Thank you, Carmen. Yeah, our assumptions are that money still talks in a privileged male voice. Our financial systems, rules, and tools were not invented by most of us and generally omitted, misnamed, and discounted females. We know slavery ended about 156 years ago, but systemic racial exploitation remains. We know that women have always worked, but only the past 50 years have the majority of women and young mothers entered the modern job market for pay. Well, sections of women have worked for pay for a longer time than that. And women and people of color are now business owners and financial managers and lawyers, and yet their caring remains discounted, doesn't it? Economics, from the Greek word oikonomia, literally means household management. And we believe that women's know-how can change an economy that has long been waged as a war to one more wisely waging life. Growing inequality and environmental ruin tell us that we can't afford more alpha male only business as usual. And that's what we're about. Our intentions tonight and every time we meet is to grow your economic confidence in your life waging value. We believe that each woman is strengthened by discovery of her own economic truth, her story, and we honor women's ways of knowing, which develop over time based on what Belinkie et al. Said in their book. They said we start out in silence, we might feel seen but not heard, we are afraid to speak up, and we're feeling dumb and disconnected. That's okay, hang in there, because the next stage is received knowledge, where we begin to listen to voices of others in authority. And tonight we have one of those voices with us, very much so, in authority. Subjective knowledge, we are still fearful, but we begin to listen to our own inner voice. We're a little bit protective of it, maybe a little defensive. And then there's procedural knowledge, when we begin to recognize different ways of knowing, interested in not only what other people think, but how their perspectives were formed. We ask questions and find some truths more reliable and logical than others. And finally, we come to constructed knowledge when we realize all knowledge is built, not born. We trust our ability to pursue knowledge by listening to diverse voices, considering lots of complex contexts, and collaborating while communicating our thoughts and our questions, while we can hold and remodel our ideas with passion and pleasure. Passion and pleasure is what we're about here tonight and in all of our conversations, which is part of what makes us a little bit different. Last month, Mary Beth Gardam invited a panel of folks to talk about housing equity and real solutions. And we invited Julie Orlando from Bergen County, New Jersey, who handles the homeless population there. And she begins and says it's foundationally important for us to provide, wait for it, housing for the homeless. Wow, what an idea. And Dev Ghoshis shared with us what a difference housing land trusts can make, enabling people who can't afford housing to purchase homes and in a partnership with the land trust. And also Rasheedah Phillips joined us and told us about a housing crisis that is affecting all of us Americans, but especially women, and especially women with children and women of color with children. So we're happy to have her back again tonight. and we're going to just talk one-on-one. Last time she brought some wonderful slides and we didn't really have time for them, but we'll be able to share some of those tonight. And if you missed our conversation last time, you can go to our webpage, and all of our conversations are recorded there, along with materials for further learning. And you can learn about any number of subjects at our webpage at that link there below. So, Rasheedah.
Hello.
I'm so glad to see you again. And
Thanks for having me.
yeah, we loved what you had to say last time. And I'm looking forward to, I've been reading about you and learning more about your great career. And an interesting element that we have in common, you are a fiction writer, a science fiction writer, as well as a lawyer and a policymaker and a mother and all kinds of other things that I am too. But I'm not a lawyer, but I am a fiction writer. And, you know, I think that imagining being in someone else's head and writing fiction has helped me to think about the economy more clearly too, from different perspectives. I don't know what you think about that, but I wonder if you could, before you show us your slides, talk to us a little bit about how you see your legal and housing and policy work connected to your creative work.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for having me. Yeah, so I have been a fiction writer since I was a young child. I can remember from the age of 3 or 4 writing sci-fi stories, writing short stories, writing all kinds of things, plays, all the things. And then growing up, really being into X-Files and all kinds of things. But because, and I talked about this last time I was here, I became a parent at a young age. I had my child at the age of 14. It really, for me, I was not able to engage creatively with, I stopped writing, I stopped doing a lot of things because I really became very focused on being a parent and getting through school as a 14-year-old and then going to college and law school. And so I, for a while, didn't really deal with it. But then once I was able to go to college, I returned back to it. And one of the first sci-fi stories I read in college was Octavia Butler's Kindred. And so reading her book, it was mind-blowing. It was just dawned on me, like, first of all, for a long time, I had not, as a science fiction fan, saw myself reflected in the fiction that I was reading. I didn't read a lot of fiction that had Black protagonists or Black women in them. And so to read this book that was not only featured and had a Black woman protagonist, but was about time travel, was just really interesting and really powerful. And then to add on top of it, dealing with very specific issues around slavery and antebellum South and freedom and just all of these really amazing things. And so that just really led me into other Black science fiction and speculative fiction authors, and then into the world of Afrofuturism, where it was a very natural thing to marry social justice issues very explicitly with thinking about science fiction or speculation or envisioning the future. And then for me, I was also very interested deeply in time travel and in thinking about time and dealing with time in the future. And so I've always written time travel fiction. And so as a lawyer who was working in housing and working with people who were deeply involved in court, it became very apparent to me that my job was, so much of it was involved with time and how I manipulate time in order to, you know, get someone more time in their home or negotiate time for them to move, or, you know, all of the time that's involved in the court system, even the time that you show up to court and whether or not it determines whether or not you have a place to live the next day. So just the ways in which time was embedded in the systems that I was dealing with as a housing attorney. And so it became very apparent that, like, Afrofuturism and science fiction was a way of thinking about and a framework for how I could approach my work as a housing person and as a policy person. So I'll stop there, but that's the basic overview of how those things come together for me.
They surely do come together. Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And please share what you've discovered about solutions that you've worked on.
Yeah. So would it be good to share my slides now?
Yes.
Sure,
Yes. Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to share a little bit about, just I'll frame the problem for you, what we're seeing, and then some of the solutions and how we can approach it, and some of the ways that I've approached it using Afrofuturism and other frameworks. So next slide, please. Yeah, so last time we talked about the ways in which, we're seeing that the housing system, right, is everyone is experiencing the crunch, particularly after the pandemic. More people than ever are experiencing housing insecurity, are experiencing an inability to pay rent. However, right, we know that these issues are particularly pronounced and have a specific impact on communities of color and women in particular, and those who sit at the intersections of both of those things, right? As well as, right, we often also don't talk about people who are at the intersections of disability, age, all of those things, right? But women and women of color in particular are definitely experiencing the impact of housing insecurity. And so just a few, again, to frame out the problem for you a little bit, in 2019, we saw that Black women renters were the most housing cost burden among renters of all racial, ethnic, and gender groups. And when I talk about housing cost burden, in order to not be housing cost burden, you should not be paying more than 30% of your income towards your monthly household expenses. And anything over that, if you're paying more than 30% of your income towards household expenses, you are considered housing cost burden. For people who are in these groups, they are often paying more than 50% of their monthly house income towards their rent and household expenses, which leaves no ability to be able to really pay for the other things that they need to pay for, and which often puts families in cycles of poverty because the rent eats first, as they say. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to zoom in a little bit to just talk about how this shows up in specific places. And you can, if you're interested in looking at this data and what this looks like for your community, you can visit nationalequityatlas.org, and it gives statistics across, it gives data across different indicators, including housing cost burden across the United States. And you can look at particular cities, you can look by region, you can look by state. And so I'm from Philadelphia. I live in Los Angeles now, but I've worked in Philadelphia for a long time, representing people who are facing eviction and other forms of housing insecurity and displacement. And so just sharing for Philadelphia what this looks like and what this looks like for women of color who experience the highest levels of cost of housing cost burden and housing insecurity. And so in Philadelphia, we see that in 2019, Black women at 60% and Latinx women renters at 66% had the highest housing cost burdens in the city. What I don't show up here is a map is the same data for people who are homeowners. And so these statistics go down slightly, right, when people have home ownership, which is often a more secure form of housing just because of the way that the systems are set up, right? But even if you're looking at people who own their homes, you still see that Black and Latinx women, even if there are homeowners, still face the highest housing cost burdens out of all groups across ethnicity and across gender. And so again, when we're talking about what it means for families to be housing cost burden, right? That means that they are not able to send their kids to childcare. They're not able to make childcare expenses. They're also often having to make compromises between whether they're paying the rent or whether they're buying, able to fill up their refrigerators and get enough groceries to feed their families. They're often having to make choices between if they have health issues, going to the doctors and having to pay for the doctors, or if there's an emergency that comes up, having to make the choice between paying rent and dealing with that emergency. And we see people over very minor amounts of money, right? If they owe rent, face eviction and get an eviction on their record, right? And so again, people are often going to choose to pay that rent over taking care of things like their health, even if that rent is exorbitant or is mismatched with where they're living, or their landlord's not making the proper repairs that are needed in order for them to have a healthy living space in the first place. Next slide, please. And so I want to talk specifically about evictions and what they look like and how they show up. And again, they have this particular impact on people whose identities exist at the intersections. And we see across the country that eviction filings disproportionately name Black and Latinx women as defendants. In Philadelphia, again, where I'm from, right? Philadelphia is traditionally known as a city of homeowners, but back in 2008, Philadelphia faced a mortgage foreclosure crisis that really evened out, right? Home ownership and rentals. And so we saw more people in the city renting. And this means that we also saw evictions rise as well, because there were more people who were renting. And inevitably 74% of those eviction filings annually were against Black women in the city, right? And so when we talk about what evictions look like and who they impact, we are talking about a specific racial and gender justice issue here when it comes to that. And this also has an impact on their children, right? Because many of these households are women-headed households. And so nearly 1 in 5 Black and Latinx children experience eviction by age 15. And then as I talked about earlier, and I won't read through each statistic, but just to say that, right, we also have to talk about how age factors in. The fact that 30% of adults who are 65 and older said it's somewhat or very unlikely that they would be, very likely that they would be evicted in the next 2 months. And then when we talk about, again, how disability shows up, and that more than 4 million people with disabilities are in families that pay more than half their incomes in rent and utilities. And when I say these, right, when I uplift these statistics for folks who are disabled or folks who are senior, I don't mean to silo them out as if these are different populations of people. No, these are overlapping populations of people. And so these issues just compound for you if you are a Black woman who is elderly, or a Black woman who has children, or a Latinx woman who has disabilities, right? They just compound all of these different factors. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then this slide, shows income by race and ethnicity, right? And as we know, right, that again, when we're talking about who is likely to, have wages that are mismatched to the rent that they have to pay or the mortgage that they have to pay, right? It is more likely than not to be women of color again. And so when we're talking about how much would people of color gain if we saw equitable wages, right? In the United States, with racial equity in income in 2019, the average annual income would have been $50,000 for Asian or Pacific Islander populations, right? So this is just one factor, and I have lots of other slides that can talk about that. And again, if you go on National Equity Atlas, you can do this breakdown across race and across other factors like gender as well. But just again, to show you, right, that inequitable income, we know that people of color, there's an income gap, there's a wage gap between families of color and their male counterparts, their white male counterparts often, right? And all of these things impact your ability to make the rent every month, to pay your mortgage, to have enough income to feed your family, and not to have to make the decisions that sometimes are life and death decisions for people. Next slide, please. And then this slide is just showing, this is just another way to look at some of the same problems that I'm talking about, right? And when we're talking about how folks are connected to opportunity. In the United States in 2019, right, we saw that the white population had the lowest share of people living in high poverty neighborhoods at 4.3%. And that Native American populations had the highest share at 23.6%. And again, not to overemphasize the point, but when we're talking about access to opportunity, when we're talking about how poverty impacts people's ability to access the jobs that they need, access transportation that they need to get to those jobs, access education opportunities, access opportunities for their children that can create generational stability around being able to access high-paying jobs and high-quality jobs. So just to say that poverty impacts more than just how much money you're getting or your income. It impacts every facet of your life. It impacts every facet of opportunity and access to opportunity that allows people, individuals and families and whole communities to thrive and to live healthy lives and have self-determination for themselves and their families. Next slide, please. So I just want to share again some of the ways that we approach this, right? And I talked a little bit about the problem. I could talk all day about the problem, right? But we also want to talk about solutions and uplift what people are doing to address these issues. And so at PolicyLink, part of the way that we approach these issues in my role as Director of Housing Policy and as an afrofuturist and an artist, I bring a lens around thinking about these issues from the lens of what I call housing futures. And this lens is really around, right, not just taking for granted that the system that we have is the system that we have to continue, or that the system was always this way, right? It's really interrogating the system that we have and understanding things like racial capitalism, how racial capitalism has played out, how housing access has played out over time to create the conditions that we have today. And that if we don't unpack and interrogate these things, we will continue to have the same future that we have in the present, right? And so Housing Futures is really about unpacking that, thinking about a new way and new approaches to talking about and dismantling housing systems that keep families locked out of the futures, keep Black and Brown families in particular locked out of access to their housing futures. Next slide, please. And so, in thinking about these approaches, and again, we started off talking about how I think about bringing science fiction and bringing speculation into my work as a policy advocate. And so it really, for me, starts with how we think about time and how in our culture, right, we tend to think about time and we associate time with money. We associate time with scarcity. We associate time with running out. And when we're starting from that level, right, we're associating time with negativity and as something that is beyond our control, we're starting from a place of scarcity. And so I try to approach thinking about time in policy with a sense of abundance, with a sense of the future can be created. The future can have input and feedback from people, from other people besides just those who are in power and authority. Thinking about how Afrofuturism, for example, thinks about time just simply by seeing Black people in the future and saying Black people exist in that future. Black people are not relegated to being in prison or being shot down in the streets or whatever it is, or being locked out of housing that causes them to be homeless for the rest of their lives. It treats time as we do have a future. We belong in that future, and that future is abundant, and we can treat time as abundant. I also pay very close attention to how systemic time is operationalized in policy and in my advocacy work. And so I have to really pay very close attention to things like how political time plays out, or as I started off talking about, how time in the courts play out, how the court system, right, the time of the court starts at 8:45, but if you're a mother who has to drop your kids off to school before court, or you have to take 2 buses because you have a disability and you're not able to, take a car and you're not able to park, right? How does that time work to cut people off from options? How does it foreclose them from being able to access their futures? So I pay very careful attention to that, and I don't treat time as taken for granted or as something, right, the political season is this and that's the way it has to be, and we can't question that, or we can't challenge that in our way and stretch time through our work. The last one I'll touch on and then move on to the next slide, so we'll have some opportunity for conversation, is thinking about the past, present, and future as open possibilities. And so in my advocacy work in particular, and I talked about evictions, right? Just to give you all an example that I use frequently because it's just the easiest one to go to, but how eviction records play out for people, right? You have a record that is, a record of a past situation that continues to lock people out from the future, from accessing housing into the far future, right? I have had clients who have eviction records, I lie to you not, from 1968, someone who was sitting on their porch as a race riot was happening in her neighborhood. She happened to get arrested. That arrest record caused an eviction, and that eviction record is still showing up 50 years later, right? And so how do we think about, again, how time works in these kinds of systems to cut people off, something from the past, cutting people off from their future? And so when thinking about policy, right, and thinking about how we can be more expansive with time, we can manipulate and shape policy to hold the kind of time that we want. One of the things that we were able to do to address this issue in Philadelphia was to create a law, tenants, working with tenants and other folks who had experienced eviction records and how they play out for them. We were able to create a protection that says that landlords cannot look at eviction records past 4 years. And landlords cannot consider, a tenant who gets rejected from a tenancy has an opportunity to bring back additional information that will unlock that past record and bring new information, right? The past is not dead. We can question the past, we can open the past. And that fundamentally shifts their relationship to the future. They now, with this law, even though it has some, it's not perfect, but it does create a circumstance where people now can open up access to housing in their futures, whereas that record before prevented them from being able to access housing. So these are the ways that if we think about time in the law, we think about more expansive ways of thinking about policy that imagines more abundant futures rather than the same old gloom and doom apocalyptic futures that science fiction likes to sell to us, which I enjoy those stories too, but that does not have to be the reflection of reality. We can shape reality to be more positive. Next slide, please. And then also how we are approaching housing policy at PolicyLink is to understand that it's not inextricable from health. I think with the pandemic, there's been a lot of conversation about linking housing to health. Housing is health, right? We've always known this to be true, and that framework and that approach needs to last beyond the pandemic itself, right? And so thinking about housing and health, not just as the absence of disease, but a more proactive instead of reactive way of thinking about health. And what else can health look like in our communities, and how do communities determine what health is for them? And that expansive sense of health that's not just tied to your body, but it's also about mental health. It's also about communal health. It's also about how we can have health passed down intergenerationally and not just think about or prioritize wealth as the thing that we pass down intergenerationally through our housing, right? Think about, and then think about how we can use housing as and community as a space to heal trauma and the exclusion that communities of color in particular have dealt with since time immemorial. Next slide, please. And then the last couple things I'll share is at PolicyLink, how we're approaching this again. We think about a winning on equity strategy in housing, where we're thinking about how we transform legal, regulatory, financial, and governance systems towards this idea of healthy housing and housing that's accessible to all and that allows for healthy, thriving futures. I'm not going to read through each of these, so again, I won't belabor this, right? But just to say that, right, we're thinking about how we center people and not profits, how we shift power in housing markets and governance, and how we support healthy communities of opportunity for all. And that's things like, I'll just name a couple highlights, how we align and activate grassroots networks and advocacy organizations on transformative policy and narrative change, right? And narrative change is really important for us as well, and thinking about not just, not thinking about narrative as just how we communicate, right? But how we use narrative and how we use it in our strategies to shift and transform systems and how people think about systems and the underlying values of those systems. And narrative strategy has a lot to do with that. And then, again, for how we shift power in housing markets and governance, making sure that low-income people, people of color, and others who have been marginalized are organized and are shaping those housing market systems and policies. And then how we increase spatially just places that provide access to just and equitable housing futures. And then next slide, please, which I think is my last slide. Yes, that is. And then just a note about what does this look like in policy form. So these are just some policies that we are uplifting at PolicyLink, and again, addressing and policies that we believe address all of those things that I talked about earlier, and especially increasing access for communities of color, as well as power and self-determination in those communities. And so when it comes to land, we think about, we're pushing policies around equitable land disposition, policies like tenant or community opportunity to purchase, which gives tenants the opportunity and power, or community groups to buy buildings in their communities that are being sold by developers on a private market, where affordable housing is being threatened to go away. So those kinds of policies, community land trusts, and how we increase investments in things like social housing. And then development, thinking about zoning reform with intentionality, thinking about inclusionary zoning, increased accountability and shared power in community planning processes. And then when it comes to housing, thinking about things like increased housing access, what I talked about a few minutes ago, tenant screening reform, and then increased housing stability through policies like right to counsel for tenants, where tenants are provided with attorneys if they're facing eviction, just cause eviction, where sounds very simple, but apparently it's a very complicated thing to just give tenants notice if you're ending their lease agreements, which is what a just cause eviction protection does. And then rent stabilization and rent control policies as well. And also doing some of that translation work between local communities who are pushing for these policies, and then what those policies could look like on a federal level, and what it will look like for the federal government to support these policies at the local level through their own policy making and budgeting. So I believe that's my last slide, and I'll end there, and yeah, we'll take any questions.
I love that last picture. That was great. Thank you. Well, you gave us so much to think about. Time and space. That is sort of basically what it's about, right? Time and space. Yeah. So I wonder looking at that last slide where you had that red arrow that went from land to housing to, what was the last one? Land, housing, and
Development was in the middle.
Oh, development was in the middle. There you go. So this is why I'm asking this question. Is it important to go in when people are organizing? Is it important to go in that sequence, or is time more flexible than that? Time and space more flexible than that? Do they fall into other constellations as well?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's nonlinear. I would definitely say that there's different constellations, there's different pairings around these policies, there's different sequences, and it really will depend on your local community and what it's ready for, what it's not ready for, what conversations are happening. Just thinking about Philadelphia, for example, the right of first refusal or a tenant opportunity to purchase policy, that's not something, that is, or even something like social housing is not really a term that is utilized there in Philadelphia, but it's a term that's utilized and has had a lot of traction in California. So it really depends on your community, right, in terms of how you're thinking about how these policies pair. And there's just so much, I have this saying that all time is local, right? All weather is local, all politics is local. Just like, so, as people say, those last two phrases, all time is local, right? And so how these policies are playing out really depends on your community and what's happening there. But that said, I think a lot of these policies have really neat pairings that can happen or work in complement with each other. So thinking about how equitable development works alongside of something like community land trust, or policies where tenants or community members become the developers, or have deep buy-in with local developers who are accountable to those community members, right? So although these are nonlinear, they definitely work together, and how they sequence will depend on your local community.
Mm-hmm. All of those examples are really great. It's clear that women in general are, suffering from a pay gap and pay a larger share of their income for housing than most men do. And women of color and women with children are especially damaged by the current policy. So do you see women in Philadelphia or in California organizing together across color lines? Do you think women are becoming allies of one another, or how are things working?
Yeah, I think there are some places where that is happening. I think in Philadelphia, for example, I would uplift an organization called Women's Way that is doing really brilliant work around economics and all of the things that you all are exploring as well through your group, and has fellowships, also explores narrative strategy. And in that group, there's, I believe through that organization, they do that across color lines for sure. California, I also so far have witnessed a lot of organizing across color lines and with different groups coming together in different ways. It's really beautiful to see. I think in Philadelphia, I would say it still suffers from a ton of segregation, and like a lot of cities do, right? And that definitely influences how people organize and how people come together. But what's interesting in a place like Philadelphia is because there is a high population of Black folks, there's just a lot of different opportunities to connect with folks. And I think people lean into those opportunities. I would say that, but yes, it's still very highly segregated, and how people organize can be segregated as well and can reflect that. But there's organizations that are doing some great work.
Good, good. Do you find that city councilors and mayors here in the United States are generally aware of women's greater vulnerability and needs?
Yeah, I want to say yes. I want to say I think so. I think a lot of cities and mayors, particularly city council members, do studies, they do research, right? They have the data often and understand what's happening, right? But their ability to make policies around it can be very constrained. It can be constrained by politics. It can be constrained by public-private partnerships and lack thereof. And I think with a lot of these things, right, when we're talking about how we close income gaps with women, or how we decrease housing insecurity with women, so much of it depends on the private sector. You know, there's so much that can happen in terms of discrimination that although we have laws for it, right, it can be hard to access those laws or utilize those protections, or requires you to be fired, you know, or something before you can make a complaint or get some relief or something like that. Or with housing, you're already evicted, or you already missed your opportunity on that house before you can go make a complaint to someone that you got discriminated against. So I think, you know, folks know what's happening out there. And, you know, over the past couple of years, I mean, I think 5 years ago, we could say, we don't really know what's happening, but now there's enough data, right, that folks, you know, they know what's happening, but folks' ability, the cities and policymakers' ability to create programs that are actually going to be impactful and that can actually, again, keep the private sector accountable, I think is the challenge.
So if those who are attending this and are interested in activism in their own communities, would their city council and their mayor be a good place to start? And are there other organizations, say like PolicyLink, that would be a good resource for data on their local community?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of great data out there. I'll name drop a few places, and then Ricky, I'll send you the links after, and you can feel free to share it with the audience. But National Equity Atlas, so PolicyLink hosts the National Equity Atlas with University of Southern California, and has all kinds of data. As I said, you can get it across different factors, not just housing, but across other economic indicators, and take a look at your region, your state, your city. So that's a great place, and you can download that data. You can download the maps. You can get it in the form of a PowerPoint. So it's a really accessible platform. I would also visit National Low Income Housing Coalition. That is a really great website, and they keep a map of where these some of the tenant protections that I talked about, like right to counsel for tenants facing eviction, where these policies are happening or where they're absent around the country. So that would be a great place to look as well, just to get some sense of like what's happening in my community, what protections exist, or what are the ones that we need in order to make a dent in this issue. National Housing Law Project, if you're more legal minded, that's a great place to visit as well, to learn about different legal housing policies as well. And then my housing team just last week put out, updated our anti-displacement toolkit. So that has a policy toolkit within it that talks about all the policies that I just named today, has things like rental registry policies, just other kinds of model policies that address community ownership of land, that address tenant protections as well. And it gives you a sense of like, where are these policies happening? What are the important elements of these policies, et cetera. So I can link you to all those, but those are some places to start in terms of what policies exist in your community, and then what should you have.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. For people who are unfamiliar with eviction policy, maybe they didn't even know there was an eviction policy in their community and haven't experienced it, where can they go to learn more about their own state and community eviction policies? Is that part of the toolkit that you were just talking about?
Yeah, so the National Low Income Housing Coalition one would be, if you want to learn specifically about what eviction policies exist, National Low Income Housing Coalition would be the best one to go to, because they have a project that has a map that will show you across the United States where these kinds of policies exist and where they don't exist. So that would be a good place to go to get the specifics around, like, just to look at a quick visual map of like, where does this kind of policy exist or not. So that would be a good place. But then when it comes to local data, it really depends on your state, or wherever you're living at, the quality of the data, what's accessible. And the places that I talked about are national, right? Like my National Equity Atlas through my organization is a national look. But again, it does give you local data, but it doesn't get down dirty, right? Like, it doesn't disaggregate to a certain level. And it's not necessarily going to tell you the politics of what's happening in your place or how people are thinking about a particular policy or how they're talking about it. So a suggestion that I would have in terms of like looking at these places, looking at some of these policies locally, if you have like a Department of Housing and Community Development, depending on how big your city is or what kind of federal funding they get, they may be required to put out reports each year that talk about the affordable housing landscape, or they may have something like a housing plan that they have to update periodically that will tell you what's happening, what's the housing supply look like, how many, what's the statistics around eviction or other measures of housing instability and housing insecurity. So it really depends on your local place. Not every place has access to that, but that's just one place that you may be able to look. And then the other place may be like, if you have a local university, there may be like departments that are looking at, doing some studies and doing some research around different housing issues. So that would be a good place to look as well. And they may have, again, more localized data. So for example, in Philly, we did a research study with Penn, University of Pennsylvania, that was the largest survey of renters in the city. And that we attached that process to, so when folks were applying for emergency rental assistance, they could take this voluntary survey, and through that survey, we built in some additional questions that asked about things like, have you ever faced an illegal eviction, illegal lockout? How often have you been evicted in the past couple of years? What are some issues with habitability and health conditions in your, just things that we're not always able to ask people, especially people coming in for legal services. We're not always able to dig into all the different issues. And then there was not a way to capture all of the illegal evictions that were happening in the city, right? Because we had an eviction database that gave you access to all of the legal evictions that go through the court process, right? But we had no way of tracking, because police don't keep track of that. Not everybody calls the police if they've been illegally locked out. And so through this survey, we were able to discover statistically significant that illegal evictions happen with the same frequency as legal evictions in the city, if not more, which is just, it's something we knew, right? But anecdotally, we knew that, and it's hard to act on anecdotal information. So just to uplift that, there may be places in your city like universities or things like that that have some of this information and data.
Interesting. Well, when I knew we were going to have this conversation, I took a look at Harvard's annual State of the Housing report, and it said in 2020, 30% of all households had unaffordable rent or mortgage payments defined as exceeding 30% of monthly household income. 35% or more, up to 50% is more common. More than 1 in 7 households paid over half their income on housing, and cost burdens rose most for those earning between $30,000 and $45,000, with home prices rising another 20.6% from March 21st, 2021 to March 2022, and rents have jumped 12% in that year. Harvard is predicting data will show unaffordability worsened in the last 2 years. And I think that's a safe assumption. And that's if you can even find housing, because another thing I discovered was that the US is about 4 million homes short of what is needed to keep up with demand, according to Freddie Mac. And they're talking about the population, the population needs housing. And affordable housing for low-income renters
accounts for about 3.6 million of those 4 million houses that are needed, which shows you, where the, we see all these McMansions being built, but not that affordable housing. And so I wonder, is it possible for the private market to address affordability, or is it really necessary for public housing to be publicly funded, at least partially? What are you seeing at HUD, which has been traditionally overseeing that kind of financial investment?
Yeah, that's such a great and complicated question, Ricky. I would say, goodness, yeah. I mean, I think the private market will not save us, and we cannot rely on it to get us out of the mess that we're in. It is the cause, in fact, for a lot of the mess itself and the perpetuation of that mess. And right, not only what you just talked about in terms of the mismatch between supply and need, but also just the fact that inflation, right, and what inflation has done, that has put us into another, recession, essentially, for a lot of people. And yeah, so we can't, and then just the fact that we'll never be able to build our way out of a housing crisis as a nation. The supply, the building will never match, right? Because as you build and as you wait to, a typical affordable housing development project takes no less than 18 months, right? You have people who are perpetually becoming homeless and housing insecure as you build. So it needs to be an all hands on deck situation. Everybody needs to lean in. Yes, we need the private market in some ways, but we can't rely on it. It's not going to save us. We absolutely need public housing, but the issue is that there's been a severe disinvestment in public housing over the past decades and continuing disinvestment in it. And so you need something in between, right? And I think it's important to have a lot of different options. You have public housing, you have social housing as an emergent consideration, right? There's social housing in Europe, and it's a thing there, but it's not so much a thing here yet.
That was another question of mine. Is social housing another word for public housing to make it a little more acceptable, or is it like co-housing, for instance, in Denmark, where they're deliberate mixtures of people choosing to live together in different ways?
Yeah, I think it's in some ways a mix of some of those things. I think communities in America are starting to understand and define what that term social housing means for us, right? Against a legacy of public housing that has by and large failed our country and the people who need it. And social housing, how it's been defined, and it's been defined in a lot of different circles of grassroots organizations and tenant organizers, how they're overwhelmingly thinking about social housing is something that is permanently affordable. So something that is permanently off of the private market. And we think of public housing that way, but it's actually not. It's not always permanently affordable, right? There's different ways in which public housing is disposed of and turned into private market housing. And so social housing is not that, right? It sees this housing as permanently affordable, and it also sees it as under the control in some ways of communities, right? Communities have an ownership interest in some way, or have control over how it's delivered. So there's different facets and elements, right? That it looks like public housing, but it contemplates something different. It contemplates something permanent, and something that is, in the control and hands of the community, so that it can be taken away when the government decides to disinvest from it, et cetera.
Interesting. Well, let me look at some of my other questions. Yeah, I mean, you've shared so much, it kind of boggled my mind a little bit. And it's such a big problem, isn't it? I mean, I was interested, I put together some definitions that I found interesting. The word housing actually is referring to collective housing, like housing, rental housing, or public housing. And it can also be the name of a protective cover over something that has intricate moving parts, like a gear, so you'd have a a housing for a gear box or something. And it seems to me human beings have intricate moving parts that are certainly worthy of a cover and of the kind of permanent housing that you're talking about. We haven't really tolerated something called homelessness, except for the last 30 years. There's been a steady trend of tolerating that, so that, when we invite someone like Julia from New Jersey to come and talk with us about homelessness, she says, well, you've got to begin by providing housing. It's like, yeah, why? Of course, but we've just gotten used to this idea of, yes, there are homeless people. It's totally unacceptable. So another interesting word that I thought was worth talking about is the word renter. I like to look up the etymology of words, the history of words.
Me too.
And it's interesting to me that originally that word referred to the rentier or the landlord. Somehow by 1650, the meaning had reversed and to mean the tenant. And I think this is important to mention because economists are increasingly talking about a rentier economy, talking about not the tenants, not the renters, but actually talking about the owners of so much in our society and how out of whack it is. I saw some statistics here from the Federal Reserve this time. They said that in late 2021, that's the latest data they have, the top 1% of households in the US held 32.3% of the country's wealth, while the bottom 50% held 2.6% of the country's wealth. Yep. And of course, it's kind of an abstract concept, and we've heard this over and over again and sort of learned to live with it, I guess, because nothing seems to be changing. But I think it helps to imagine what that really means. If you picture, let's say, an auditorium where there's a really important play of your life happening that everybody wants to attend, right? There are 100 seats in that auditorium. That's all there are. It's 100%, right? And so the first guy in line comes in and he reserves 32 1/3 seat for himself, one person, right? And the last 50 people in line come in and they have 2 1/3 of a seat to share. What does that tell you about what's going on in our country?
That's such a great analogy.
It's sort of a picture of what is wrong with this picture. So I think home ownership and permanent housing of the sort that you're talking about is so important for us to think about creatively. And I just want to call out, when we're homeowners, we're so proud of it. And people say, how many here own your house? And people will raise their hand and feel good about it, But the truth is that a mortgage actually is defined as, it comes from the French and it means dead pledge, which means it's a deal that dies only when the loan is fully paid off, which means if you are not evicted, what happens when you own a house and the bank
foreclosed?
Yeah, you're foreclosed. Any money that you put into it is now the bank's, right? And so you can't raise your hand and say, yeah, I'm a homeowner unless you've totally paid off your mortgage.
Yes.
And all of us have 30-year mortgages, right?
Exactly.
So
they call us bank tenants.
Yes, that's right. That's a good name for it. Yes, that's what we are.
Yeah, no, exactly. I love that you look up the etymology. I love etymology too, but I have not looked up the etymology of these words, and it's really interesting. But I've been having the same conversation with my colleagues around this notion of home versus housing, right? And when we talk about housing, who are we talking about, right? And who are we referring to? Me as a person who I'm a homeowner, I also rent, I have the privilege to have 2 homes. And for me, right, like this idea, I don't call my home housing, it's just home, right? But for someone else, it's housing, and that term housing gets very, very disparaged. And it's like, those people need housing. No, we all need housing, right? We all need home. So just very interesting that you bring that up. That's something that we've been talking about as well.
Yeah. Oh, good. I'm glad to hear it. Well, other questions I had were, what have you heard about HUD and Joe Biden's administration that might give you hope, or what are you hearing that makes you unhappy? What updates can you give us on it? Because we don't hear much about HUD anymore, do we?
Not as much as we did with the last administration, that's for sure. And that's probably a good thing right now. But yeah, no, I think HUD and the Biden administration are doing some interesting things. They're making some interesting commitments around housing that I, and not that I've worked a long time, but I've been at least working the last 2 administrations and have not seen around commitments to housing. And so one of the things that they recently put out, that the Biden administration recently put out, was the Biden affordable housing plan. I forget, affordable supply housing plan, I believe is the whole thing. And although I think, right, there's critiques we can make of that plan, again, the emphasis on building new housing and the supply versus, really understanding the nuance of how building alone is not really going to save us. But what I appreciate about the plan, right, is that it links into other agencies. It does not just silo housing and building affordable housing as its own issue. It talks about, well, infrastructure, right? We need the infrastructure. We need to be talking about how infrastructure works to constrain building new affordable housing, or how it can work in concert, and how we need to be thinking about tenant protections when it comes to, building infrastructure and things like that. So that's what I appreciate about how this administration's approach to housing is, that it's not just siloing it out, it is leveraging other agencies, and he is taking this sort of all hands, all agency approach to government, all of government approach. I think with HUD, and this is, I think, also symbolic of the administration in general, they're really thinking about equity, right? The stage that they're at and thinking about equity is what some of us might think of as more at the beginner stages, but at least they're there, right? They're talking about equity. They have equity plans. They're incorporating equity language and frameworks into their work, into their legislation, and some really exciting things I think can come from that. I have seen also certain agencies doing really great work, like the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau has really increased some protections and guidance, and has just done a really great job pursuing bad actors around some of the issues that I talked about related to tenant screening and credit screening, which we know is a huge issue for women in particular as well. And so it's been promising to see things like that. And again, them really taking a understanding of equity and that it's needed in order to really advance particular policies. Yeah, and I think HUD is doing some good work too. We're looking forward to a new law coming out soon called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. This was a law that was previously promulgated under the Obama administration and then was rolled back during the Trump administration and then reinstated. So we're hoping to see a better and improved rule that really gives communities the ability to participate in fair housing planning in their communities in a very real way. So that's another promising thing that we hope to see. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think they're doing some good things. They could always do better, but I think there's some promising things happening.
Do you think it's important that the federal government be involved in this project, or is this a state or city focused problem?
In terms of housing in general?
Yes.
Yeah, I definitely think the federal government has a huge responsibility to play. I think all governments, local, state, federal, it's the most important issue of our time, of all times, anytime, right? Because we need housing, we need homes in order to do anything, in order to access any other facet of our lives. How can you do that if you don't have a stable home? How can you do it well? People do it, right? Unhoused folks, they know how to survive out here, but they shouldn't have to. That should not be the situation. And just like other governments in other countries have taken up that issue and they see it as important, to have a thriving nation. In order for your nation to be thriving and to be able to work and have a strong economy, people have to have homes. People have to have homes to go to and sleep in and live in. So yeah, it's absolutely the responsibility of our federal government.
Well, you know, the word that is at the root of economy is oikos in Greek, and it literally means home or dwelling place.
Wow.
And we certainly learned that housing was central to the economy in 2008, did we not? When
Exactly.
Wall Street was gambling on housing securities and crashed the whole economy. They're still doing pretty well, but the rest of us are not doing so great. So we still need to address all of that, don't we? It's at the center of things. You're right. You're so right. Well, we want to have some time to engage other people who might have questions out there. I see there are things in the chat that that I haven't been paying attention to because I've been talking with you. But Mary Beth, could you give us a hand with the Q&A and help us out? I see chats in the chat. No question?
I think we have 2 questions in the Q&A box, unless the 2 of you have already covered these.
In the Q&A box, you see, I forgot to look there. I was looking in the chat. Okay. What are those? Let me look. How can folks find out what their community's eviction policy is as a starting point to get engaged? And does PolicyLink have endorsed eviction policy templates that can make a big difference? You talked go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So I think I shared a few places and a few links, and like I said, I can share back after so that you can share those links out with other folks. But yeah, you can look on National Low Income Housing Coalition for where if these policies exist in your community. And then if you all want to, feel free to reach out to me directly if you want to like search specifically for the eviction policies in your area. I'm happy to help if I can. And then in terms of, do we have eviction policy templates? We do have some model policies, and we can also get some if there's a specific kind of policy that you're looking for. So for example, with the eviction records, tenant screening policies, I do have access to some model policies as well. And then also working with some partners who can also share some model policies or some thoughts if you're working on crafting one of these kinds of policies. Right to counsel for eviction is another one. As well. And as I said, we at PolicyLink have an anti-displacement toolkit that has examples of all of those different kinds of policies. So I can share that afterwards as well.
Rasheedah, I wonder, the eviction policies, the parts that you're talking about, it sounds like there are several parts to it. Does it require state legislation, or is it a matter of, city policy or county policy? Or
yeah, it really depends on where you are. So for example, a place like Pennsylvania, where I'm from, right, it is really challenging for lots of reasons to get policies passed at the state level. We would be very hard pressed to even like touch our state landlord tenant act, because once you open it up, other people can start messing with it and make it worse than it is. And so in Pennsylvania, because Philadelphia is a home charter city, which means we can make rules a little bit differently than other places in the rest of the state, it's easier to make policy there versus if we were in like Bucks County or somewhere outside of Philadelphia, right? And then Pittsburgh is also maybe a place where like it's easier to pass a local policy rather than trying to get something passed at the state level. So it really depends on where you are. But again, I'd be happy if folks need some advice or just some suggestions around where to look and how to get started on thinking about what this looks like in your area. Feel free to reach out to me.
Great. Another question, how are women in these low-income, poor communities using mutual aid organizations to share childcare and other caring expenses?
Yeah, so I can only speak to Philly. I know there's a lot of exciting mutual aid work happening around the country, but Philly has really exciting mutual aid stuff going on there. So there's a mutual aid network called Housing Reparations that is specifically white people and white passing folks who are raising money, raising mutual aid funds for people for housing, for different housing issues, and primarily do mutual aid with trans women and people of color who need housing funds for various things. So that's really exciting. And then also I have my organization, so I'm part of our arts collective, and we've had a mutual aid fund since 2011 actually, where we use proceeds from different afrofuturist events and sci-fi events that we do, and have a community-based mutual aid fund that is not active at this time, but we were doing that. We've been doing that for a long time. Yeah, so lots of exciting things that people are doing. I think there's different implications that come from doing mutual aid around taxes and things like that. But there's also organizations out there that have given people advice around how to do mutual aid. So it's really exciting to see these kinds of things build up in different communities. Also, something I would love to uplift is time exchange as well. So that's another form of mutual aid that I see, like time banks and things like that are happening in Philly and other places. There's a group called Womanist Working Collective that is another actually really great organization that I think does some cross-racial organizing as well. But they have a time bank that they use, and they do childcare exchange and other things. So that's a great mutual aid network.
Great, great. Well, here's another one. There is an organization called Mayors for Peace, which aggregates support for cities to oppose nuclear weapons. Is there a similar mayoral organization to support equitable housing innovations?
You know, I am not sure about that. I know that there is a mayor's poverty kind of network that sounds very similar, but they look at poverty in particular, which includes, I think, housing issues, but not focused specifically on housing. But it would be interesting to see or start as a network like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps somebody in our audience knows more than we do about that. So put it in the chat if you know of anything like that. Anyone? Okay. So I think, well, here's one more. What about enacting laws against gentrification, shoddy public housing, and environmental justice in marginalized communities?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are people trying to develop policies to address these issues. I think they would not call it against gentrification, right? Because that word itself is controversial. It can mean a lot of different things to different people and looks like different things in different communities. But I think some of the policies that speak to and attempt to address things like gentrification are things like inclusionary zoning policies. For example, so inclusionary zoning policies are policies that can, if they're mandatory, require a landlord or a developer to include affordable housing if they're developing a housing site. So for example, it may be that if you, for every 9 units that you build, you have to build an affordable unit. So those are some of the policies that we're seeing, and other types of inclusionary zoning policies that make it easier for people to build multifamily housing and low income housing in communities as well. So we're seeing those kinds of policies that are meant to address some of the ramifications of gentrification. But really, also, I think what we're starting to see emerge that addresses some of these policies is things like housing reparations programs. So you may have heard in Illinois, they started a housing reparations program there. That's for people in the city of Evanston. That's directed at people who have lived there for a certain time and have faced or dealt with housing exclusion and segregation, being able to get funds that will enable them to purchase homes. So those are some of the policies that we're seeing emerge that would address some of the ramifications of gentrification. But again, you know, it has to be very tailored to what your community is experiencing. And then in terms of shoddy public housing, that is a whole nother conversation. Yes, there are there's people developing policies and legislation that addresses this. And then also the federal government has attempted to address modernization of public housing, but has done it in some ways that people will call problematic and that may actually lead to gentrification in certain communities. So it's a very nuanced thing how you address some of these issues in communities.
It is indeed. Well, you certainly have shed an enormous amount of light on this subject tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rasheedah. And thank you, everyone who attended and asked such great questions. And well, you were part of the conversation too. Carmen, would you bring up a couple of slides again here? I just want to let people know that next month, we're going to be talking about women and worker power, talking about women's union leadership. You've been reading about unions in the newspaper, places like Starbucks and Amazon getting organized, and when nobody saw it coming, and it's kind of exciting. And just as exciting is a rise of women in leadership roles in the labor movement, which is a new development and pretty exciting because from what we've seen and a little bit of research that we've begun, women have a way of widening the conversation to collective bargaining for the whole community. And that's what we're interested in talking about. So register to join us on Monday, October 24th at 8 p.m. And we've got some great people, Teresa Mitchell Dudley from Maryland, Afifa Khalik from Florida, Patty Machek in California. And where I am, we hope to have someone from the National Nurses United group. They're working on finding someone to join us too. Next slide, please. Yes, I just want to thank you for joining us and ask you to stay in touch with us by going to our webpage. There's the website again. We have a insider update newsletter. It comes out every month. We hope you'll subscribe to that. Contact us with your ideas, with your suggestions. And by all means, if you can, donate to help us amplify women's economic voices and values, like the voice of Rasheedah Phillips tonight. Rasheedah, have you left already? I wanted to say thank you again. Good night, everyone. You're all part of the change. Let's keep on keeping on. Good night, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you again.